I want to dig into a question before we start with Salahuddin. And it's always been interesting to me that when we talk about Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala and we talk about the regaining of Al-Quds, the regaining of Jerusalem, there's a question that is often not asked. And that question is, how did we lose Jerusalem in the first place? You see, subhanAllah, you have the glorious entrance of Sayyidina Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, and then somehow 400, 500 years of history just disappears into thin air, and we immediately start talking about the hero once again opening Jerusalem. It was understandable with Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu entering into Jerusalem in the glorious way that he did, that Islam had dawned with the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and this was a natural extension of the da'wah of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, and a glorious prophecy fulfilled with the best of the companions of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. But what about Salahuddin? And so I actually want to spend some time just talking about the few hundred years between Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu opening Jerusalem for the first time and then the reopening of Jerusalem by Salahuddin Al-Ayyubi rahimahullah ta'ala. And it's almost a perfect set of events between 639 and 1039. And so you talk about these 4 centuries where significant things will happen that make Jerusalem, that make Al-Quds open to the vulnerability that allowed the crusaders to sack it for the first time. And so we come to the very beginning of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu once again opening Jerusalem. He establishes the Umari pact that gives all sorts of assurances to religious communities, that guards religious relics. The Sahaba relocate to Jerusalem. Many of them relocate to the areas of Palestine. Some of them will die there. Al-Quds becomes a hub of Islamic learning. It becomes a place where Muslims around the world come as pilgrims. And what makes Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu's pact so significant is that the system that he put into place in the 600s remains intact all the way until the crusaders come and rupture it, which shows you the beauty of it, the coherence of it, the consistency of it, and the way that the Muslims, for the most part, upheld what Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu had set into motion. So the ihsan of Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, the excellence of Umar radiallahu anhu, still breathes through the city of Jerusalem. We come into the 700s, and as Islam is spreading throughout the world, you have, of course, Abdul Malik ibn Marwan building some of the most beautiful and prolific sites in the area of Al-Aqsa, the Dome of the Rock. Al-Walid ibn Abdul Malik expands some of what his father did in the courtyard of Al-Bayt al-Maqdis. And as Jerusalem, as Palestine is becoming this bustling center of Islamic scholarship, something happens politically which is important, and it's often underestimated. The Umayyad Khilafah was based in Ash-Sham. Because the Umayyad Khilafah is based in Ash-Sham, there's naturally more emphasis on the architecture, on the establishment, on the infrastructure of the place that the Khilafah is in. And so when Ad-Dawla al-Abbasiyya, when the Abbasid Khilafah takes over, the Abbasid Khilafah moves to Al-Iraq. And when it moves the center of Islamic power to Al-Iraq, and by the way, this isn't about right or wrong, I'm just talking about natural consequences of infrastructure and emphasis from a political perspective, from an architectural perspective. When the Khilafah moves away from Ash-Sham, there is naturally less emphasis that's going to be placed on some of the development of those areas. You come to the 900s, and something extremely significant happens about 1,000 years before the crusaders are able to penetrate and to wreak the havoc that is historically documented. The Dawla of Al-Fatimiyya, the Fatimids, the Dawla of Al-Fatimiyya take over Jerusalem. And a Dawla Al-Fatimiyya is an interesting establishment that many times we kind of gloss over in the history of Salahuddin. They are an extreme sect that emerges out of Shi'ism, but even to mainstream Shi'as, they are extreme. They are going further away than what the majority of Shia would consider as orthodoxy within their school of thought. And they are the makings of what would become the Ismaili school in terms of their creed. So if you study the Ismaili school, then you can see the way that the creed itself is very different from the creed of what we know within Al-Islam. And with that expansion of this dawla, so you still have the Abbasid Khilafah, but you have a split, you have junctures. With their taking over Jerusalem, they start to implement things that are foreign to the Muslim population, foreign to the people themselves. And they quickly become a hated form of governance there in Al-Bayt al-Maqdis. And they start to chip away at some of the holy sites, especially to Ahl Sunnah, because the idea is to direct things to a new doctrine, to a new creed. And so they're very difficult to deal with, and Jerusalem naturally starts to feel, Al-Quds starts to feel some of the pressure of that leadership. You come into the year 1009, and particularly you have a man by the name of Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, who becomes the leader of that dynasty, the Fatimid dynasty. And he is known as the crazy ruler, literally the Majnoon, a madman. He was a kid when he assumed leadership, very erratic, crazy, would gradually start to make more claims of divinity. And subhanAllah, you almost start to see a complex where he pushes the boundaries every single year. Now, why is he important to the story of the Crusaders? He does something that Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu did not do, and naturally Umar radiallahu anhu is not looked at favorably by him in the first place. He's a hated figure, and so the legacy of Umar is all over Al-Quds. The legacy of Umar radiallahu anhu is all over Jerusalem. He desecrates the Holy Sepulchre, which Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu had of course maintained as a symbol of respect. And that was deeply rupturing to the relationship between the Muslims and the Byzantines at this time, and sends shockwaves through Europe. But he doesn't just desecrate Christian sites, he also bans Hajj, because they see the Kaaba as not so sacred. They see what is happening in Mecca and Medina as taking away from their creed. So he also bans Hajj. So he's desecrating holy sites, he bans Hajj. At some point, he even calls himself Al-Hakim bi Amri. So instead of the one who commands by the will of God, he's the one who commands by his own will, signifying a deification of himself. And at some point he disappears. Okay, so he disappears from not just rule, but he disappears, period. So his death and the circumstances of his death are very mysterious. He's deified by some sects. So you'll see, for example, in some strains of the Druze, he's deified by them. He's looked at as a saintly figure, an interesting human being, to say the least. The year 1039, after he disappears, the church is reconstructed. So that part of any type of rupture between the Muslims and the Christians, or Islam and Christendom, is made peaceful for the moment, right? At least there isn't a desecration of the site. At least the site is maintained as Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu had guaranteed. Now, what happens to the Crusaders, or how do the Crusaders start? And this is, in fact, one of the most important contexts to understand as to how we lost Jerusalem in the first place. Europe is plunging into full-on economic despair. So they have massive resource deficits, they have famines and plagues, they have population issues, there is much corruption with the elite class. So there's a full-on corruption of the way that wealth is distributed. So Europe is falling into all sorts of economic despair, partly because of the corruption that is present within Europe. And in suffering that famine and that drought, and the population is dwindling and resources are dwindling, and you have mass corruption and bad distribution, you needed to find a way to turn this into a religious conflict, to turn this into some sort of holy war or righteous war on the Muslim world, to justify what really was an attempt to rescue Europe from its economic despair. And many historians will say the same, that the true nature of the Crusades was more economic than it was religious. So it was as much about Antioch and Edessa as it was about Jerusalem. And in fact, when you read about the Fourth Crusade, it completely removes Jerusalem from the equation, or it focuses entirely on the richest Muslim city. So it focuses on Constantinople, Istanbul today, because the idea is to gain as much treasure and to gain the most accessible port in the Muslim world possible, to where you can transfer riches back to the Crusader kingdom. And so Venice and the Italian districts wanted the ports of Asham. Other European states were focused on China and India and the Silk routes and the spices and the different ways that they could access the East and access Asia and access pathways to Africa. And they felt cut off by the Muslim world. And so Europe needs to pillage the Muslim world under a religious call in order to bring back prosperity to the failing Crusader kingdom. Everything that you see back then has a parallel today. Just read about the gas off of the coast in Gaza. There are going to be nefarious parties, malicious motives, even more malicious than the obvious malicious motives, that will push certain parties to the table. And so the drums of war are being beaten in Europe against the Muslim Ummah to pillage the Muslim world. And it is not because tensions have boiled to a point to where it's just become untenable between the two, between the Muslims and the Christians, and therefore we have to escalate this war. It's because Europe has economic woes, primarily. Secondly, the Muslim ummah is in complete shambles. We always get in our own way. And subhanAllah, you think of the hadith of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, da'awtu rabbi thalath. I made dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala for three things. Li thalath. I made dua that Allah would protect us from famine. This ummah would not be wiped out by famine. Allah answered that. I made dua that this ummah would not be wiped out by an external enemy. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala guaranteed us that as an ummah we won't be wiped out by anything external. But the third one, أَلَّا يَجْعَلَ بَأْسَهُمْ بَيْنَهُمْ, that there is no misfortune, or that their misfortune does not come at their own hands due to their own disunity. Allah Azza wa Jal did not give the Prophet ﷺ that, because the ummah is responsible to maintain its own unity, its own cohesion, because Allah has already given us His habl, He's given us His rope. وَاعْتَصِمُوا بِحَبْلِ اللَّهِ جَمِيعًا وَلَا تَفَرَّقُوا. That's your covenant. Hold on to the rope of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's been extended to you as an ummah. When you hold on to it together, you're guaranteed greatness. The Muslim world was completely fractured, and as a result of it being fractured, impotence. You have the Abbasid Khilafah in one place, which is becoming a complete non-player in global Muslim politics. You have Al-Fatimiyya, Dawla Al-Fatimiyya, which is heretical to a point that it does not represent at all anymore what the spirit of Islam was supposed to be. You have the Seljuks in Iraq. You have so many different places where different empires and different players are at play, and this offers an opportunity for the crusaders to come in and to penetrate a divided, weakened Muslim world that is busy with its internal feuds and its internal disputes. Those are the two major factors that lead to making a place like Jerusalem so vulnerable. And so I'm going to give you the names of some important figures. I want you to put yourself in Europe right now. The year is 1095. We're 400 years or so after Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu enters into Jerusalem. A man by the name of Pope Urban II gives his famous speech at Clermont. And you can look this speech up, by the way. It's his most famous address. Pope Urban II stands to initiate the Crusades. And as he initiates the Crusades against the Muslim world, he describes the Muslims as the following. He describes them as a vile race, number one. Number two, accursed and alien to God. Number three, a generation wholly given to the service of demons. Number four, take arms against the barbarians, not your brothers. And so you think about like all the marks of dehumanization that precede some of the most disgusting genocides in history. Just look at the man's speech. This is the Pope speaking. So you think about the religious justification and cover that's going to be given to the Crusaders to wreak the havoc that we know on the Muslim world. They are looking at us as a vile race, accursed, foreign to God, alien, and barbarians that should be fought instead of their brothers. On top of that, we're in the service of demons. And so a satanic, pagan race. Now think about propaganda. I mean, back then, how many people in Europe had interacted with Muslims in their daily lives? Like you think about now how dehumanization becomes possible without interaction. Think about that world and the way that peoples were separate, and how when you portray a people like that, you give license to kill in an entirely different way. On top of that, he calls on robbers to become knights, meaning we will release our prisoners and our most brutal people and send them out into battle. He calls on robbers to become knights. He offers full amnesty for any crime that's been committed, so long as you go to the Muslim world and you fight against the Muslims and you serve in these crusades. He offers debt relief in response. Open spoils of war. Whatever you can collect in the battlefield, collect it. It is yours. And the last thing, the icing on the cake, full redemption of sin when you kill the pagans. And so whatever sins you have committed before will be gone when you enter into the Muslim world and when you serve in this holy war against the Muslim world. By the way, when I say it's relevant and this precedes what will happen in Jerusalem, just read the papers of Donald Rumsfeld and John Ashcroft and the Bush administration and the orders they were giving to the military before the invasion of Iraq. It was crusader language, invoking specific references from the Crusades, and that's how you portray a people, and that's how you dehumanize them and become inhumane yourself. What does that lead to and translate into? What is the introduction of the Crusaders to the Muslim world before Jerusalem? The most significant one is what is known as the Massacre of Ma'arra. The Massacre of Ma'arra. This takes place in December of 1098, and it's around modern day Idlib. SubhanAllah, when you think about all that Idlib has been through. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala see forth the entire liberation of our brothers and sisters and completion of their victory in Syria. Allahumma ameen, what they've been through. So the Massacre of Ma'arra is particularly, as Ibn al-Athir rahimahullah says, the most shocking incident of the Crusaders entering into the Muslim world and really put on display their immorality. Like it became a legend. The way that they acted in Ma'arra became legendary in the sense of evil. It sent shockwaves that a people could do this. Now keep in mind, this precedes the Mongols. Right? We're not even talking about the Tatar and what would come from them yet, and at the hands of the Tatar. So this was really, really new to see the way that a people would behave, especially while carrying crosses, right? They're coming in the name of religion, plunging into the Muslim world with the flags of crosses sanctioned by the Pope. And what do they do in Ma'arra? Ibn al-Athir rahimahullah says they massacred 30,000 civilians in cold blood. 30,000 Muslims, they put them to the sword in cold blood. If you look up, this is what there are chapters in books called When the Crusaders Became Cannibals. When the Crusaders became cannibals. Because subhanAllah, at this point, what they unleashed of themselves in that process. We look at what the Zionists do in Gaza and we think, how crazy are these people? Like, how do they not see how beastly they have become in the process of making us into animals? How crazy and beastly have they become? You have to think about what the Crusaders had in their mind about the Muslim world that was taught to them before they came to the Muslim world, and how that sanctioned beastly behavior that maybe was foreign to them before. And so Albert of the Franks, this is from their side, he writes that in Ma'arra, our troops boiled pagan adults in cooking pots. We boiled them in cooking pots, and we devoured grilled children on skewers. They ate the people. They cooked and they ate the people. And this was supposed to be a sign of their domination over the Muslim world. But in the process, they had unlocked the evil, the true evil that was present inside of them, and what they planned to do with the rest of the Muslim world. As for the exploitation of women, as for what was done beyond murder, our imagination can go to the worst of places, because clearly they had no limits in what they were willing to do to the Muslim world as they came into Sham, as they started to pillage the area. And then you come to Jerusalem. The sad thing about Jerusalem is that when you move to July 15th, 1099, July 15th, 1099, it only took them 5 weeks to take Al-Quds. 5 weeks, a little over a month. And that's a sign of how weakened the Muslim world had become, how much we had relinquished the grip of glory that we had from the time of Sayyidina Umar radiyallahu ta'ala anhu. And the barbarians of Ma'arra, who were actually the Crusaders, enter into Jerusalem, and you can imagine what they did. And by the way, it wouldn't just be against the Muslims. The Jews this time, whose side do you think they were on? Umar radiyallahu ta'ala anhu was the one who brought them back after, remember the conflict that they had with Herakl. Umar radiallahu anhu settled their communities. The Jews were on the Muslim side. The Eastern Christians, historic Christian communities that were not under the Catholic Church, were also alongside the Muslim. And whatever they were able to put up with in terms of a fight was insignificant in the face of these people. And so for the most part, people retreated to their holy places, and the Crusaders went into Al-Aqsa, and they killed up to 70,000 Muslims as they entered into Jerusalem. They burned the Jews alive in their synagogues, and they even set fire to the Eastern Orthodox churches. So they burned alive people and murdered anywhere up to 100,000 people as they took Jerusalem on that dark day of July 15th, 1099.
Raynald
Of Aguilares. So this is not the famous Raynald that we were talking about, but he's one of the Crusaders. He writes about it. He says, in the temple and Solomon's porch, men rode in blood up to their knees and up to their horses' reins. They flooded the streets with blood. They destroyed the masajid. They destroyed everything that was holy to anybody else. And they beat back the Muslims, whatever existed of the Muslims, to different regions. At that time, Imaduddin Zengi rahimahullah ta'ala of the Seljuks, he fights back in Iraq with whatever he can, but he has limited success against the crusaders before he himself is going to be assassinated. And his second son, Nuruddin Zengi rahimahullah ta'ala, will take command of the Zengid dynasty. And this is where we come to the story of Salahuddin. You cannot talk about the story of Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah without talking about Nuruddin Zengi rahimahullah ta'ala, who was the mujaddid before the mujaddid, the warrior before the warrior, the leader before the leader, the mentor of one of the greatest human beings this ummah has ever seen. You cannot talk about Salahuddin without understanding Nuruddin Zengi rahimahullah ta'ala. Imam ibn al-Athir rahimahullah ta'ala says that there has not been a man that this ummah has seen since Khulafa al-Rashidin like Nuruddin rahimahullah ta'ala. Not a more competent and great leader that this ummah has seen since Khulafa al-Rashidin like Nuruddin rahimahullah ta'ala. Nuruddin establishes his rule in Halab, in Syria. So his brother takes what's left over of Iraq from his father, and Nuruddin takes Syria. He establishes himself in Syria. And Nuruddin is someone who fights back the crusaders valiantly and is able to beat them back from major strongholds, and is able to establish multiple sneak attacks on different crusader strongholds, and quickly becomes a boogeyman of sorts to the crusaders. As he is rebuilding his rule in Syria and beating back the crusaders from certain regions, he also establishes over 40 madaris, 40 schools, scholarly hubs of learning, because he sees that the revival of ilm, the revival of the Quran, is central to the revival of the ummah. And so he mandates his warriors to go through religious training. The generals in the army of Nuruddin are all huffaz of Quran. He mandates that they learn once again, and he also wants to spread the sunnah in the face of what had happened under ad-Dawla al-Fatimiyya. So he's taking through different routes to beat back the crusaders and to beat back some of the influences that had weakened the ummah from within. So he's a righteous man, an incredible human being. And subhanAllah, an entire lecture should be and could be dedicated to him. But tonight we will not be able to do him justice because we want to focus on Palestine and his role in Palestine. Suffice it to say, as Ibn al-Athir rahimahullah says, Nuruddin rahimahullah ta'ala commissioned the construction of the minbar that would be placed in Masjid Al-Aqsa once Masjid Al-Aqsa was retaken from the crusaders. And it took a couple of years, and you can imagine the psychological impact on the people that Nuruddin, the leader, is already constructing the minbar of Al-Aqsa. When we take it back, this is the minbar that we will place back in Masjid Al-Aqsa. And the way that he's trying to instigate the emotions of the believers so that they can understand that what has been taken from them is not going to be considered insignificant, nor will it be forgotten amongst the ummah. And this impacts Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala growing up. Imagine growing up in that shape, where you know that your predecessor has already built the minbar, that one day, today when we hold the keys of Palestine from the Nakba, you say, one day you will open your home. One day we will return to our lands, even when it seems impossible. We're taking this from our turath, we're taking this from our tradition. Like subhanAllah, one of my teachers, he said something very profound once. He said, what dress have you prepared for the day of Fath Bayt al-Maqdis? What are you going to wear the day that it's opened? That there are some that would put aside even their relics, that the day that Jerusalem is opened, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala, this is what we will enter in with, bi'idhnillahi ta'ala. So it's part of the psychological and spiritual growth of the believers. So Nuruddin rahimahullah ta'ala has this minbar built, and it would not be installed in Al-Aqsa until 2 decades after he's already passed away. And that's not the point, right? The point is that he's generating something special in the hearts of young people around him. He is reigniting the ummah towards something that is special. And so Nuruddin and the Zengid Empire are embedding the idea of Bayt al-Maqdis in the hearts of young people. They're putting that back in the hearts of the ummah. And they're right there in Sham at the gates of Jerusalem, which is the most fortified city right now that represents crusader domination over the Muslim world. And there's an important lesson here, that you might say that Nuruddin failed. if you're looking particularly at or specifically at his political endeavors. That Nur-ad-Din was never able to take back Jerusalem in his lifetime, and he certainly tried. But sometimes it's not the individual or the group that tries to do it the first time. Sometimes the credit should go to those who didn't relinquish the idea even if their efforts fell short, because they place the fruit in the hearts and in the minds of those who will come after them and have the same sincerity as them, and will see the effort through by the permission of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and Allah rewards everyone in the process of that. Everyone that was a part of that process. And so if you're just going to clip out Nur-ad-Din's chapter, and this is extremely important right now, if you were going to clip out Nur-ad-Din's chapter, you might deem him a political failure without looking at what came after him or what he put into Salahuddin after him, because you'll say he wasn't able to do it. The odds were against him. He built that minbar, but what did he actually achieve? When he lived and when he died, his entire life, Jerusalem was under the crusaders. It's not the point. This is an ummah where transition and transmission comes through the hearts. That light is transmitted from generation to generation. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows what everyone has put into that process. So this is Nur-ad-Din az-Zengi, rahimahullah ta'ala, and we'll talk a little bit more about him inshaAllah ta'ala as we start to introduce Salahuddin in this process and focus on some of these lessons. So Salahuddin is born in 1137. Where was he born? In Tikrit, in Iraq. And he wasn't an Arab, he was a Kurd. Nur-ad-Din also was not an Arab, which shows you, subhanAllah, that the connection to Al-Aqsa has to transcend Arabism, has to transcend that. It has to be a cause of the ummah. Imad-ud-Din was not an Arab, Nur-ad-Din was not an Arab, Salahuddin was not an Arab. And subhanAllah, there are some who even tried to connect Salahuddin to an Arab ancestor to make him Arabi. It didn't matter, and it doesn't matter what you can find in his lineage or if you can try to connect him to an Arab ancestor. This is a cause that's greater than the Arab. This is the cause of Islam and the Muslims. This is the cause of every single person, and the one who connects their hearts and efforts to it is just as connected to it as anyone else, because Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala makes sacred links through what physical links cannot make. And so there are different claims that are made to Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala. By the way, funny enough, even after the glorious chapter of Salahuddin will close, some of the Europeans will try to justify in their minds how such a great man rose amongst the Muslims, who they had portrayed as barbarians and as lowly people all this time. How did the greatest general of their time arise from them? And their conclusion in some of their books was that he had a European mother. And so he had to come from something else, because it doesn't make sense otherwise for him to be this person. And I want to say about Salahuddin Ayyubi rahimahullah ta'ala before we continue, that this is a man who, subhanAllah, when you talk about qabul, when you talk about acceptance in the hearts of the believers, has been given a status in the ummah that is unparalleled. I want you to think about the amount of time that has passed from his time to our time, and the way that his name has been invoked generation after generation after generation. That is enough to tell you what a special person he is in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that he has been in the hearts of believers for over an entire millennia. It's unprecedented, it's unheard of for someone that comes that far after the Sahaba to have that type of a status amongst the believers. And when you read about him, he deserves it. He deserves every bit of that praise that he receives in the ummah. He deserves every bit of that acceptance, because this was a man who was born and bred and who lived and died with the ummah in his heart. A selfless human being, subhanAllah, who had vision, who had sincerity that is unparalleled in his time. And I also want you to appreciate the circumstances that he was born in and how close he actually was to the time of the Prophet ﷺ. I was trying to reflect on this context. The time between us and Salahuddin is 1,000 years. The time between the context of Salahuddin, not necessarily the birth of Salahuddin, the context of Salahuddin and the death of the Prophet ﷺ is 400 years. That means that the effect of that generation of the Prophet ﷺ and the generation that immediately followed is very much so still present. Like, I think about this in an American context. They talk about slavery being 400 years old. The effects are still very present. There are easy ways to trace your lineage. You know who your great-great-great-grandfather was. If you look hard enough, you can trace the development of villages and cities. You can see the same structures. That's how close it is to to the Prophet ﷺ. And so that should help you appreciate that there is something very special that's still in the air to be salvaged, and that makes the destruction of a place like Jerusalem and the pillaging of the Muslim world that much sadder in his time. And so you have this man, rahimahullah ta'ala, that's a Khalid ibn al-Walid-like figure, the greatest general in this ummah after Khalid radiallahu ta'ala anhu, who we would have the great victories on his hand. What is his actual name? What is his actual name? Does anyone know? His actual name is Yusuf. His actual name is Yusuf. And Salahuddin is the honorific that is given to him, rahimahullah ta'ala. And this is deeply profound because it will factor into the way that he lives his life, rahimahullah ta'ala. His father was a general under Imaduddin, whose name was Najmuddin. His father, Najmuddin, was a general under Imaduddin. Remember, Imaduddin is the father in Iraq, and when he dies, his son Nuruddin, his second son, assumes the rulership of the dynasty based out of Syria, based primarily out of Syria. So he's a general under Imaduddin Zengi, rahimahullah ta'ala. And before Salahuddin was born, his mother had an interesting dream about him that she went to the dream interpreters with. She said, I saw a dream that in my stomach was a sword. And so subhanAllah, you talk about a ru'ya and a prophecy that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will bring out of this man. His mother saw him as a sword in her stomach before she actually gave birth to him, rahimahullah ta'ala. And subhanAllah, what happens on the very day that he's born is that his father, his mother, who just gives birth to him, have to flee from Tikrit because of an attack. So you can imagine the day of his birth, he's a refugee. He's on the move on the day of his birth. His father is expelled the day of his birth. And as they are on the run, one of the generals says to his father, Najmuddin, that this baby of yours must be bad luck. It's got to be bad fortune, right? The day of his birth, you're expelled and you're on the run from Tikrit to Mosul in Iraq, right? Both in Iraq. So this baby must be of bad fortune. And he responded and he said, rather, it may be that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has planned through him a good fortune that we can't comprehend. There might be something in his qadr that is way beyond anything that we can perceive. And so I think about those children that are born in Gaza that were born while their parents were on the run, and perhaps babies that were born, subhanAllah, that will never know their parents. Babies that showed up in the makeshift hospitals and their parents had been killed in the same bombing. Allah Azza wa Jal knows what may come out of this generation of genocide. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala give izzah to this generation. Allahumma ameen. And so they're fleeing to Mosul, where Imaduddin, the father is, Imaduddin Zengi rahimahullah ta'ala, and he takes in the soldiers who fled, including his general, Najmuddin Al-Ayyubi, the father of Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala. Eventually, as we said, Imaduddin will pass away, and Nuruddin assumes the rule in Syria. So Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala is going to grow up in what city? In Damascus, in Dimashq. And as he grows up, to give you the context of Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala, the sentiment around him, everything was anti-crusader. Everything is anti-crusader. Everything from the culture to the poetry to the stories. And so that's one very important context to have, that he's born in the devastation of the crusaders. And the crusaders have Jerusalem. And he's born in the shadow of Nuruddin Zengi rahimahullah ta'ala, who will become his greatest mentor. That's number one. Number two, there's a defeatist atmosphere, that the Muslims will not be able to fight back this monster of the crusaders. And I think about our day and age, you think about the climate, Anashid al-Intifada, and the different poetry and the different songs that children are nurtured with. And it's important for them to not just have those songs and to have that poetry and to have that connection, but to also believe that that connection will eventually manifest in victory. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has promised us that these songs will not stay in our ears alone. That this poetry will not merely be recited on our tongues as we are distant. That Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala will see us through. So he grows up in an anti-crusader climate, but a defeatist climate as well. He also grows up in the masjid that became a focal point, subhanAllah, in the last few weeks. Qaddar Allah ma sha fa'al. The Umayyad masjid. He grows up in that masjid. That's the masjid that he memorized the Quran in. That's the masjid that he learned the fiqh of Imam al-Shafi'i in and became a master of the Shafi'i madhab. That is the masjid that he grew up playing in, that he grew up practicing his military arts in. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala grows up as a student of knowledge. Simultaneously, he grows up as a warrior. He learns everything from religion to astronomy to Greek philosophy to diplomacy to the arts to everything about military skill. And subhanAllah, he takes a deep interest to the legend of Nuruddin rahimahullah ta'ala, even more so than his immediate relatives, to the legend of Nuruddin, as well as the scholars that are around him. So he loves the ulama and he grows up in the shade of the scholars and he praises the scholars. So he could grow up to either be a scholar or a warrior or both. But he looks at Nuruddin rahimahullah ta'ala as an absolute hero. And Nuruddin rahimahullah ta'ala sees in Salahuddin a very special kid and spends time investing in Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala and mentoring him as well. And so it's only at the age of 14 that he becomes an official soldier in the Zengi dynasty directly under the command of his uncle Asaduddin. You'll notice a lot of Uddeens. I'm sorry. Inshallah ta'ala, you'll be able to capture them. So his father is Najmuddin, his uncle is Asaduddin, his mentor and the leader is Nuruddin. There we go. Hopefully you all memorized it by now, inshallah ta'ala. I won't take you further than that. So he becomes a commissioned soldier in the Zengi dynasty under his uncle Asaduddin, who in Western literature is also Shirku. And as he grows and flourishes under him, he's quickly ascending the ranks of the military. Now, by the way, this is an important point. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala, in terms of physical stature, actually was not very big. He actually didn't have a dominant physical stature, and so it was easy to overlook him in the ranks of the military. But his haiba, his awe-inspiring presence and what he was able to do, pushed him through in ways that he was gaining the attention of everyone within the ranks of the military. Nuruddin is receiving the reports of this growth of his father, until he passes away, is seeing Salahuddin, his uncle is seeing him. And so eventually the year 1164 comes and Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala is appointed as a commander of a battalion to engage Egypt. Egypt is under Ad-Dawla al-Fatimiyya, is under the Fatimid dynasty, which at that point is the largest superpower in the Muslim world. The Abbasi Khilafah is really a small Khilafah. It's more symbolic than anything else at that point. So it's the most dominant force in the Muslim world. And this is where, subhanAllah, you start to see the wit of Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala. That Salahuddin is a Sunni scholar and warrior. He represents a Sunni dynasty, right? And we're talking about a dynasty that again is further than even mainstream Shi'ism. So we're talking about ideologically two different powers, but he's patient. Salahuddin rahimahullah sees an opportunity to build from within Egypt. And so he goes into Egypt, and through negotiations, his uncle becomes a wazir initially. His uncle becomes a minister under the Fatimid dynasty, under Dawla al-Fatimiyya, despite everything that is happening there. And eventually, his uncle passes away, and Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala is appointed as a wazir, appointed as a minister under the Fatimid dynasty in Egypt. So there, he not only trains battalions and develops an army, he consolidates all sorts of power. For one, he builds universities and madaris all throughout Egypt in the same mold that Nuruddin did in Syria. So he starts to build madaris throughout. Madaris of hifth of Quran and learning creed and learning jurisprudence and to grow the scholars. He increases, subhanAllah, this is really interesting, but he saw that it was important to increase the wage of the teachers. If you want to look at how a society values education, look at the way that it pays its teachers, right? And so it tells you a lot about how Islamic scholars can be valued and how imams can be valued and how teachers, those that teach your children, can be valued. And it's important for a society to be uplifted in that way and to have education prioritized. And so he increases the office of the educators, if you will. He builds these glorious madaris all across. And in the process, he also becomes a noted orator. So he's giving khutbah in Egypt. He's a general in Egypt. He's building madaris in Egypt. His popularity is growing. He survives multiple assassination attempts. SubhanAllah, it's remarkable how many times this man was almost killed. Now, one time in Egypt, he's literally stabbed in his helmet, in his head, and he doesn't die. Rahimahullah ta'ala. So he survives multiple assassination attempts because some people are wary of his power. He slowly starts to change things. The adhan was altered to hayya ala khayr al-amal, come to the best of deeds. So he slowly starts to bring things back to hayya ala salah, hayya ala falah, bringing them back to the deen, growing with the people. And then he finds an opportunity. He's still technically paying allegiance to the Fatimid leader, within the dynasty, as he gives his khutbah, he makes dua for him. But he finds an opportunity to suddenly push the boundaries, and he omits the name of the ruler of the Fatimids in his khutbah. The leader of the Fatimids passes away. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala assumes a greater role of power as a natural leader amongst the people. He changes the allegiance in the official sense, symbolically to Ad-Dawla al-Abbasiyya, to the Abbasid Khilafah, and he continues to now consolidate his power, and I'm omitting a lot of details because of time. He continues to grow and consolidate his power throughout the region. So the madaris that he built are systematically upon what he has put, as well as older madaris like Al-Azhar is changed to fit a coordinated curriculum that grows the people in the deen across the board, and again fits the mold of what Nuruddin rahimahullah put into motion. And so subhanAllah, you can imagine the religious transformation of Egypt, the psychological transformation of Egypt under Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala. He then secures the Hajj routes, because remember, the crusaders would attack the Hajj routes, and even the Fatimids, at least under Al-Hakim bi Amrillah, they banned the Hajj. So he secures the Hajj routes from Egypt and the Sudan, and this makes him extremely popular with the people. And so he becomes known as the defender of the Hajj because he secures the route of the pilgrims. He then captures Yemen. So if you think of a mind map of what Salahuddin is doing, he takes Egypt and then he captures Yemen. And by capturing Yemen, he gains control over the ports, over the Red Sea. And by having control over the Red Sea, he's able to import and export using the ports and enrich the economy under his rule in Egypt as well as Yemen. And so his power is quickly growing. And by the way, this is all happening within a matter of 3 years. This isn't taking decades. This is unfolding rapidly. Now what happens, and subhanAllah, this is the case of fitna always, that there are efforts to pit Salahuddin now in Egypt and Yemen against Nuruddin, his teacher, in Syria. And so the suspicion is growing, the fitna is growing. And of course, the crusaders could want nothing more than to see these colossal leaders go at it, Nuruddin and Salahuddin. And just as that fitna is starting to grow, Nuruddin Az-Zangi rahimahullah dies a natural death in the year 1174 by the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, without them ever having actually fought, which is an incredible mercy from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, because the forces were being put into motion to pit these two powers against each other and to have the familiar internal turmoil within the Muslim world. But Allah Azza wa Jal spared Nuruddin from that, and spared Salahuddin of that as well, and spared the ummah as a whole of that as well. In the process, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala wants to continue to unify the ranks. And so he now takes the Zangid Empire and he absorbs it into the Ayyubid dynasty, if you're looking at it from historical terms. But under his power, he now starts to bring Syria under his power as well. He takes Damascus, he takes Halab, and subhanAllah, he does things in a very diplomatic way. At the end of the day, he's trying to soften the hearts too. So wherever he can spare bloodshed and consolidating power in the Muslim world, he does so. And so the son of Nuruddin rahimahullah ta'ala was too young and quickly passes on. And the widow of Nuruddin, Ismat, is now technically in charge of the throne, and Salahuddin marries the widow of Nuruddin, and this helps consolidate power as well. So he marries the widow of his teacher, and this helps bring power as well into his ranks. And so he becomes the first sultan of Egypt and Syria. Over time, subhanAllah, he will gain Syria, Egypt, Yemen, the Hijaz, parts of Libya and beyond. So he consolidates beyond, and Iraq as well. He's given legitimacy. In Baghdad, he's given legitimacy as well. So this is a man, subhanAllah, who consolidates power and who sees the importance of unifying the Muslim ummah before you can take on a monster like the Crusaders. And that is perhaps one of the most important lessons in studying Salahuddin, that even a man as brilliant and remarkable as him knew that it was important to solidify everything around as well. That Jerusalem has to be the central focus, but Jerusalem cannot be the exclusive focus of reformation, of restoration of the ummah. That it was important to unify the ranks and solidify the ranks as he gained focus and he started to focus the Muslim world on what was happening in Jerusalem. And subhanAllah, of his greatest qualities, this is a remarkably patient man. It took him 1 decade to do this. For 2 years, he was operating in Egypt under a dawla that was completely foreign to him. And within 10 years, he survives over 20 assassination attempts. And you know, when Ibn Abbas radiallahu ta'ala anhuma says about the ayah, لَمَّا صَبَرُوا وَكَانُوا بِآيَاتِنَا يُوقِنُونَ, that Allah made them imams when they were patient and when they had certainty in our ways. SubhanAllah, look at the man's patience. He's always optimistic. He's always determined. He's always resilient. He operates at a pace of his own, where he's not hasty. He's very wise about everything he's doing. He's very calculated about everything he's doing. But at the same time, he always sees that important moment where he can take that next step. Now you have to think about the crusader perspective. The Muslims are coming together. Therefore, Jerusalem is at risk of falling to the Muslims once again. Nur ad-Din's protege is growing in power. We suddenly can't keep them fractured. And you have to understand that our enemies always want to weaken us from within through the tactic of division. The Romans were thrilled with the wars amongst the Sahaba because that gave them a chance to breathe with everything that was happening prior to that. And here they are thrilled, the Crusaders were thrilled with all the internal turmoil and dynasties that were at competition in the Muslim world so that they could continue to just take more and more and more and exploit it without finding any real competition. So Amalric of the Crusaders tries to exploit the division, but he dies. Then from the Crusader side, Baldwin IV, who is a young man with leprosy and who's very ill, takes charge. And because of that, they're a weakened empire. As Baldwin IV assumes charge, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala sees that they are weakening and he tries to take advantage of a moment. And subhanAllah, this is so important because just as much as you cover his victory, you have to also cover the times that he fell short. In the year 1177, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala makes an attempt on Jerusalem. He thinks that he has a pathway to Al-Quds. He takes his path, he tries to stage an attack on Al-Quds to retake Jerusalem. Not only is his army defeated, but they're cut off from the back, and Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala is almost killed in that process. And it is just as important to cover that defeat as it is to cover the fath that will come later, because even though he was quote-unquote defeated, he wasn't deterred. And that's actually part of the point as well. You know, when you think of Salahuddin, you think of, all right, guy is born, he's just a master of everything, just goes to the gates of Jerusalem, says, I'm here, reads some Quran, and then takes it. There's a process here that's unfolding, where he's defeated, but he's not deterred. He's not demoralized. So he goes back and he rearranges himself, continues to try to consolidate power. And subhanAllah, there's a narration that it's even said to him, because he's a sultan and they're thinking about power and territory. Look, you have Egypt, you have Syria, you have Yemen, you have the Hijaz. How come you're not smiling? Why aren't you content? And he said, how could I smile when Bayt al-Maqdis is under crusader occupation? All of this is irrelevant to me if it doesn't manifest in the retaking of Jerusalem. I'm not doing this for power. I'm doing this so that we can retake Al-Quds, so that we could retake Jerusalem. And it's even narrated that some said to him that we saw in astrology that the astrologers have said that if you try to retake Jerusalem, you'll lose an eye. He said, I'll lose both of my eyes. I don't care. That doesn't matter to me. He's focused on Al-Quds. He goes back, he regroups, and he thinks about how to retake it once again. 2 years later, April of 1179, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala meets one of the largest armies of the Crusaders at the Golan Heights. And he has up to 40,000 men with him, and he defeats the Crusaders in the area of the Golan Heights. The Druze in the area actually pledge allegiance to him, and so he consolidates power in that area as well. Baldwin from the Crusaders secures a truce with Salahuddin. So they enter into a 2-year truce. Why would Salahuddin enter into a truce with the Crusaders? Because he sees that it's an opportunity to consolidate more strength and power from the Muslim world when the time comes again. So Salahuddin takes the truce as an opportunity to continue to unify and bring the Muslim world under a singular power structure. The year 1183 comes, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala has everything from Halab to the Hijaz. Mosul is still an issue for him, and the truce is violated by a man by the name of Raynald Raynald de Chatillon. This man, subhanAllah, is one of the greatest enemies that Islam has ever seen in its history. The Fir'aun of his time, truly, if there was to be one, is Raynald, also known as Reginald, Raynald de Chatillon. If you look at a map right now and you were to draw from Damascus all the way down to Mecca, to Al-Hajj. Then you'll see right in between, there is Karak in Jordan. I'm not talking about the tea, all right? The famous city, and you have the palace. Raynald is a crusader general who is situated right there, and it's right on the route from Syria to Hajj. And despite claims by Baldwin that he has instructions not to attack the Muslims on the way to Hajj, he just can't help himself. The man constantly attacks the Hujjaj and attacks the Muslims on their way from Syria to Al-Hijaz. He cannot restrain himself. He captures them, he kills them, he steals from them. He does everything the truce entails that he's not supposed to do. Baldwin claims that this is Raynald acting on his own, but this causes a disruption in the truce, and then eventually Baldwin seeks another truce. This time with Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala for 4 years, okay? For 4 years, a 4-year truce. SubhanAllah, how these things start to sound so relevant to our times. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala agrees to it. They even have discussions about how Muslims will be able to visit Jerusalem and to at least rebuild what has been destroyed, and some security guarantees of Christians that come into the territories or of the Muslims at that point. So there are negotiations that are ongoing during that time. As that happens, Baldwin the fourth dies. Baldwin the fifth, his son, takes over as a child ruler. Doesn't last long because he's also a very sickly child. His sister takes the throne and then appoints her husband, Guy of Lusignan, as the king of Jerusalem. If you read in the English literature, by the way, it's spelled as Guy. His name is not Guy. Guy of Lusignan is appointed as the king of Jerusalem. So there's a new ruler to deal with, a new power structure to deal with from the Crusaders. So Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala is upholding the truce. But as we said, this man, Raynald, is an incredibly evil human being. And I want to give you a little bit of context of this man, Raynald de Chatillon, and what he tried to do, and how they tried to psychologically demoralize the Muslims. And if you were a Muslim living at that time, what type of shaking and what type of doubt could be instilled in your faith. Al-Aqsa is taken. Raynald says, I am going to take the Kaaba and destroy it, and then I'm going to go and pull the body, and he uses a derogatory word about our Prophet ﷺ, which I will not repeat, but I'll go pull his body out from Medina and crucify his body to make a display out of him. So his goal was, we took Jerusalem, I also want to demolish the Kaaba, and I want to steal the body of the Prophet ﷺ. Nuruddin Zengi rahimahullah ta'ala, when he was still alive, he had a dream of the Prophet ﷺ in Medina looking disturbed, and the Prophet ﷺ pointed to 2 men. When Nuruddin woke up, he immediately sent to Al-Madinah, and he identified the exact looks of those 2 men. He said, find these 2 men. And subhanAllah, these 2 same men were crusader agents that had penetrated into Medina. They posed to be tulab ilm. They posed to be students of knowledge. And they were digging a tunnel in Al-Madinah to the body of the Prophet ﷺ to try to confiscate the body of the Prophet ﷺ. And Nuruddin rahimahullah foiled their plot. This was at the commissioning of Raynald de Chatillon. So Raynald tried to steal the body of the Prophet ﷺ. Used to regularly attack the Hujjaj. Wants to flatten the Kaaba in his own expression. Salahuddin hates this man. So within this 4-year truce, because he can't help himself, here they are again passing through Karak, and Raynald attacks the Hujjaj again. He kills some of them, he takes some of them as hostages, he steals all of their belongings. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala, in upholding the covenant, he offers an opportunity to distance themselves from what Raynald has done. Give the hostages back, compensate for all of the harm that you've done. Raynald insists that he's not going to do it. He insists that this is his right, and he's going to continue to attack the Hujjaj anytime they cross through Karak. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala swears by Allah that he will kill Raynald by his own hand. That Raynald de Chatillon will be killed by his own hand. And subhanAllah, go back to the Prophet ﷺ, Hudaybiyah was supposed to be a 10-year truce. The Meccans violated Hudaybiyah, which led to Fatah Mecca. Here, Raynald, in historical Christian sources, is blamed as the guy that gave up Jerusalem, because it was because of his actions that Salahuddin rahimahullah basically acted upon the broken truce and decided to carry forth with his offense against the Crusaders and to retake Jerusalem. So they accredit him for the fall of Jerusalem, as Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala now had an opening to go into Jerusalem and to take it back and to continue the war against the Crusaders. So Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala intercepts Raynald's troops with a fleet that he sends under Husamuddin al-Lu'lu. And as this happens, this will lead up to the famous battle of Hattin, which is the gate of Al-Quds. The famous battle of Al-Hattin. Raynald had taken Nablus, he'd taken Beirut, he'd taken all sorts of other towns around, and they were basically guarding Jerusalem from different fronts. And so the fights between the Muslims and the Crusaders are in full effect. And as he's entrenching, or as the Crusaders are entrenching themselves to guard Jerusalem, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala takes a different strategy. Just as he patiently unified the Muslim world under a central power, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala made it a point to capture all the unsuspecting forts. And so he starts to clean up around Jerusalem. So he takes back Haifa, he takes back Beirut, he takes back Nablus, he takes Akka, he takes all of these different places. He captures the forts, and then he patiently surrounds the main army, the main fort of the Crusaders. And in the process, he uses his military genius. So like Khalid ibn Walid radiallahu anhu, if you read about Khalid radiallahu anhu, his main tactic was deflection. So he creates these boogeymen, these deflections in different places that take the army by surprise, and then he's able to move in deeper. He poisons wells along the way. He attacks with small groups of archers, these crusader bases. And so imagine when you're trying to sleep at night, but then from far away, a few arrows rain down on you. And so what that does is it creates a paranoia amongst the crusaders wherever they are, that at any point these archers might rain down upon us. And so they have sleep deprivation now. They have all sorts of paranoia and panic amongst them. They never know, as they're in those areas, where Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala has commissioned some of his men. So he's using small battalions to demoralize and deprive them of any type of morale that they're building around Jerusalem, that they're building around Palestine. And then comes the Battle of Hattin. Now, subhanAllah, as Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala arrives, as we know the story, subhanAllah, that Salahuddin is checking the tents of the Muslims to make sure what? Not that they are militarily equipped, to make sure that their tents are lit up at night and that they're praying Qiyamul Layl. And Ibn Shaddad rahimahullah ta'ala, who will talk about his biographer, he mentions that Salahuddin would not miss a night of tahajjud. That this was a man, no matter how busy, no matter how tired, no matter how engulfed he was in the battle, always found his time to turn on the lights in his tent and to pray to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala at night for victory. And this was one of the most crucial ingredients of his success. So Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala is making sure that his soldiers are praying and that his soldiers are ready. Under the king of Jerusalem, Lusignan, you have 1,300 of the most skilled knights that will come out to fight the Muslims. Their headquarters had been Masjid Al-Aqsa, the destroyed Masjid Al-Aqsa, had been the headquarters of the Knights of the Crusaders. He sends his most skilled knights, and he sends 15,000 troops. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala amasses an army of about 20,000 people. And they meet for the Battle of Hattin. Just like the Battle of Badr, the use of archery gives the Muslims a strategic advantage. And so as the battle begins, the Muslims rain down so many arrows that the army cannot advance in any way, to the point that they say that even an ant would be hit. Precise with their arrows, striking them and beating them back as they seek to come forth. And they rain arrows throughout the day and the night. As that's happening, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala is gathering intelligence from within as to what their weaknesses are. He comes to find out that they're short on water. They're short on water. So what does he do? He sees the direction that the wind is blowing, and he sets the grass on fire. And the wind blows the fire onto them, and they don't have water amongst themselves to put that fire out. And so their army is demoralized. On top of that, remember the true cross that the Persians had stolen from the Christians, and that Herakl had hoisted on his back and put back in the sepulchre, and was guaranteed safety by Umar al-Khattab radiallahu ta'ala anhu. They came carrying that true cross because they thought that if they carried the true cross, they could not lose. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala was able to acquire the true cross from them. And this completely psychologically demoralized the Crusaders because they knew that they were done at this point. And so the Muslims would come back to Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala and they would say, An-Nasr, we won. He would say, not yet. And he would say, until you've captured every single battalion and until you've struck at the tent. We've won, we've won, we've won. And he made sure that they had complete victory. And then he came down and he did sajda to shukr, rahimahullah ta'ala. And it was at this point, by the way, that Raynald the Chatillon, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala, would kill him with his own hand, as he had promised, as he intercepted him before the fall of Jerusalem. And as I said, I'm skipping a lot because I want to focus on the lessons. The 20th of Rajab, and you can look at the date right now on your phone, by the way. The 20th of Rajab, which correlates to the 2nd of October, 1187. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala begins his front on Jerusalem, and he lays siege for 6 days. And then it would be on the 27th of Rajab that he would enter into Al-Quds. And if you remember when we covered Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj, that is the date that many scholars hold, would have been the night of Al-Isra wal-Mi'raj. The night that the Prophet ﷺ led all of the prophets, the Anbiya, in prayer on that miraculous journey. And as Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala enters into Jerusalem, you can imagine the emotions of the Muslims that have been subjected to all sorts of horrific crimes before that point. You can imagine the spirit of rightful vengeance. These people beat our children against walls, grilled them and ate them off of skewers. These people exploited and violated our women in the worst of ways. These people burnt down Masjid Al-Aqsa, desecrated everything that was holy to us in Jerusalem. And we've been banned. There was no adhan in Al-Aqsa for almost 90 years. Can you imagine? Almost an entire century. So when you tell me Palestine is over, the qadiyya is over, it's not over. Almost 90 years, not an adhan in Masjid Al-Aqsa. But Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala lives up to his legendary name, Yusuf. And he offers terms to the crusaders. He offers safe passage. Women shaved their heads and desecrated themselves because they were afraid that the Muslims would do to them what the crusaders did to the women of the Muslims. We're not like them. We can't be like them. People protected their wealth that they thought would be looted. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala offers safe passage and safety. And on top of that, as they desecrated our sites, he restored their sites and guaranteed their places of worship. Just as Umar radiallahu ta'ala anhu, when he entered into Jerusalem. Now as the time goes on, I want you to imagine the emotion then when he brings forth the minbar that was built by Nuruddin rahimahullah ta'ala and installs that minbar in Masjid Al-Aqsa. May Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala protect it. Allahumma ameen. And I also want you to appreciate that this war did not stop. Salahuddin showed every form of ihsan that you could possibly show. But you know what? The crusaders launched the third crusade and they came back. And Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala stayed the course and he kept on protecting it. And this is important that you don't get caught up in a moment of euphoria and victory and think that it's all over. Because it's often then when you put your guard down that you're struck. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala guarded the forts. The crusaders gathered some of the largest armies, up to 600,000, some historians even say under Frederick, up to 1 million soldiers to come and fight and to retake Jerusalem. Frederick drowned. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala rose. And he continued to protect. And yes, at times he lost some of the towns around Al-Aqsa. He lost some of the towns around Jerusalem. But he continued to guard the forts of the Muslims. And it was Richard who said that as long as Salahuddin is in Jerusalem, it will never be taken. And indeed, it was not taken while Salahuddin, rahimahullah ta'ala, was amongst us. As we come to his death, I want to mention the name of the man who chronicled his life up close and personal. You keep hearing me say Ibn Shaddad. And this man, his name was Bahauddin ibn Tamim from Mosul in Iraq. He was a scholar, he was a wise man, he was a poet, a qadi. And the reason why he's called Ibn Shaddad is because his maternal uncles are from Banu Shaddad and he was raised amongst them. So his famous nickname is Ibn Shaddad. And there are other Ibn Shaddads in history. And he gained such prominence chronicling the Muslim world that Salahuddin rahimahullah summoned him from Hajj to come to him. And then Salahuddin rahimahullah took him as a close confidant and a close friend. And ultimately he became one of Salahuddin's closest generals and field commanders, but also his biographer, writing about some of the things that were happening behind the scenes with Salahuddin. He says, I swear by Allah that Salahuddin did not miss Salah in congregation even in the battlefield in his tent, that he established his salah in congregation, and that when the nights would become darkest and the people would retreat to their beds, Salahuddin rahimahullah would retreat to his qiyam, even in the fiercest of battles. This is a man who lived in the battlefield, who never had a moment of respite and always turned back to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And I want you to think about this. He never actually reaches the threshold of zakat because he would spend what came to him fi sabilillah. And so he doesn't steal the money of the Muslims, which was common as leaders would enrich themselves on the backs of the Muslims. Salahuddin's goodwill to the Muslims was evident in the way that he carried out his life. And one of the most shocking things that I always think about, the man never made Hajj. Salahuddin never had the opportunity to do Hajj. His whole life was spent in battle. He never got a break to even go and to do Hajj. But look at the status that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has given to him amongst the Muslims. He says that I remember times that it would be 3 days and he wouldn't have a morsel of food in his body. A true warrior in the battlefield with his people. 3 days he wouldn't have a morsel of food in his body. And he would often bemoan the lack of response from the rest of the Muslims. And he would wonder, when would the ummah wake up and meet the challenge, rise to the great challenge that they had? And he didn't want to be seen as the singular savior of the Muslim world, but he wanted to see the Muslim world as saving itself by attaching itself to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and what Allah azza wa jal had made sacred. Ibn Shaddad says, recounts these moments sitting with Salahuddin in Asqalan, on the shores of Gaza. And Salahuddin looking out at the water and talking about his desire to spread Islam throughout the world, and hoping that the Muslims would continue on his legacy, and hoping that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala would give him the ability to spread Islam far beyond what he had done in those moments that he had. And then Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala tested him with a fever. He's back in Syria, in Damascus, and for 2 weeks this intense fever takes him over. And he's only 55 or 56 years old, but it becomes clear that the greatest general, perhaps in the history of Islam after Khalid ibn Walid, was going to die in his bed the same way that Khalid ibn Walid died in his bed. Despite surviving 20 assassination attempts, despite living in the battlefield, like Khalid radiallahu anhu, who pulled up his sleeves and showed his body to his companions and said, every single part of me is struck. How is it that I'm dying in a bed? Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala would die in his bed. And the Quran reciter would continue to recite by him, and he would, as he started to phase into an unconscious state, he would react to certain ayat of the Quran. As the reciter came to, لَقَدْ جَاءَكُمْ رَسُولٌ مِّنْ أَنفُسِكُمْ عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَءُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ in Surah At-Tawbah, that there has come a messenger amongst you. عَزِيزٌ عَلَيْهِ مَا عَنِتُّمْ حَرِيصٌ عَلَيْكُمْ. He cares so deeply about you. It greatly pains him what pains you. He is compassionate over you. بِالْمُؤْمِنِينَ رَءُوفٌ رَحِيمٌ. Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala would nod. He would say, Sadaqt. You've told the truth. And then when we came to Huwa Allahu alladhi la ilaha illahu, Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala suddenly started to engage intensely with those ayat, repeating after the reciter, Huwa Allah al-Malik al-Quddus, Ashhadu an la ilaha illallah wa ashhadu anna Muhammadan Rasulullah. His face beamed as he took his last breaths, affirming that Allah azza wa jalla is the king of all kings, and affirming his tawheed, and he breathes his last at the age of 56 years old in his bed in Damascus, to be buried right next to the masjid that he grew up in Masjid Al-Umawi. When he passes away, people could not believe that he passed away. There is a mythology that was developing around him. How could Salahuddin die, rahimahullah ta'ala, as often happens with great men? And the reciters had to remind the people in the streets of Damascus that were wailing in tears and in disbelief and wanted to see his body for themselves, the same ayah that was recited when the Prophet ﷺ died, وَمَا مُحَمَّدٌ إِلَّا رَسُولٌ قَدْ خَلَتْ مِنْ قَبْلِهِ الرُّسُلُ, that Muhammad ﷺ is but a messenger, and messengers have come and gone before him. And when he passes away, they look into his estate, and they found that he only possessed 47 dirhams of silver, 1 dinar of gold, which wasn't enough to even pay for his janazah. Greatest leader of the Muslim world that we know of couldn't even pay for his own janazah at the time of his death, and it had to be taken from his family. The streets flooded as they came out for the janazah of Salahuddin rahimahullah ta'ala, and it's narrated that the people said at his gravesite, "O Allah, as his final victory, as you open for him the doors of Jerusalem, open for him the doors of Jannah. Allahumma kama fatahta lahu abwab bayt al-Maqdis faftah lahu abwab al-Jannah. O Allah, as you open for him the doors of Jerusalem, open for him the gates of Jannah." Something along the effect to say that he was granted victory here and he did his job here. So grant him, O Allah, what you have promised him there. And they buried next to him in his grave what? His sword. And they said to him, هَذَا تَتَوَكُّ عَلَيْهِ إِلَى الْجَنَّةِ. You will lean on this into Jannah. Use this as you enter into Jannah. SubhanAllah. Born in his mother's tummy as a sword and buried with the sword right next to him, where he was the great defender of the Muslims. And he was buried next to who? Nuruddin Zengi, rahimahullah ta'ala. I want to end with this thought. My father was sharing this with me, subhanAllah, and I looked it up, that the French colonialist, Henri Gouraud in the French Mandate of Syria in the year 1920, famously walks up to the grave of Salahuddin rahimahullah and he kicks it. And he says, "Wake up, Salahuddin, I'm here. Wake up, Salahuddin, I'm here." The taunting of the Muslim world, the taunting of our heroes, it's not the first and the last time that we will see it, and they will seek to provoke and incite and awaken the sentiments of the ummah. And in the poetry of my mother, may Allah have mercy on her, with the addition and with the consultation of my father, may Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala preserve him, that as the Bosnians were being genocided by the Serbs, "Ya Salahuddin, qum lan yantahi al-mashwar, laqad aatha as-sirbu fil ardi fasadan, faman yahubbu li akhd al-thawr." O Salahuddin, stand up because the journey is not over. The Serbs, and in this case the Zionists, have filled the earth with corruption, and so who will stand and avenge their crimes? The invoking of the name of Salahuddin is not the invoking of a god. It's not the invoking of a saint. It's not calling upon a mere mortal to stand up. It's the invoking of our own generations to say that who exists amongst us that will take up that call with the same passion that he had, rahimahullah ta'ala, and through that passion and sincerity be granted incredible tawfiq from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, incredible success, miraculous victory from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And miraculous victory does not come except through sincere exertion. Salahuddin is not someone who woke up and had Jerusalem handed to him. He's not someone who woke up and had greatness handed to him. He worked for it.